What if Europe woke up to find Russia writing the rules? That's exactly what happened. Overnight, with a single signature in Moscow, Vladimir Putin unleashed an economic decree so secret, so tightly guarded, that not a single leak escaped. No hints, no speculation, just silence. Then, suddenly, the news broke. An announcement that sent shockwaves through Europe. Governments rushed into emergency meetings. Headlines screamed, "Unexpected" and "masterstroke." But this wasn't typical retaliation. No military moves, no threats. Instead, Putin quietly inverted Europe's economic power by turning Western principles against them. At the center, a set of rules forcing foreign companies, many European giants, to choose, return and pay taxes, or forfeit their assets to Russia. Billions in investments switched hands overnight. For the first time in years, Moscow, not Brussels or Berlin, set the terms. If you think power only shifts with armies, think again. Ignore this, and you miss the blueprint for how influence can be seized, with paperwork. So what did this decree actually say, and why was Europe so stunned? Let's break it down. For years, Europe set the terms, Russia responded, until now. Since the first sanctions, the script was familiar. Brussels proclaimed new restrictions, Western leaders projected unity, and Russia pushed back, defensively, sometimes loudly, but always reacting. The power balance seemed fixed. Europe, with economic might, called the shots. Russia responded. Everyone expected it to stay this way. If Moscow retaliated, the West assumed it would be reactive or disruptive, never subtle. Few anticipated Putin's move. A precise, strategic economic decree, crafted for legal and strategic effect. Here's what happened. Instead of saber-rattling, Putin's government issued a document establishing a special regime for managing foreign assets and capital frozen or withdrawn from Russia. In simple terms, the rules flipped. Now, Russian law, not EU courts or Western regulators, would decide the fate of billions in European investments and property inside Russia. Assets European corporations tried to lock up or abandon were suddenly under Moscow's control. This wasn't just paperwork. Overnight, the architecture of sanction pressure was reversed. European ministers rushed to emergency meetings as reality sank in. As one French paper put it, Moscow acted with surgical precision. The numbers were staggering. Within the first quarter, Russia would control over 300 major industrial and energy assets, formerly owned by foreign companies. But the real impact wasn't statistical. It was symbolic. For the first time in years, Europe couldn't respond in kind. Russia wasn't shouting or threatening. It calmly, legally asserted control, showing it now set the terms. In Brussels, disbelief gave way to panic. Some floated sanctions against sanctions, only to find Russia's move was airtight within international law. Western analysts were stunned. One wrote Putin had pulled off a grandmaster's move, using Europe's legal logic against it. As Moscow stayed silent, European banks and corporations scrambled to their lawyers, desperate to regain control, a far harder task now. The decree set strict deadlines, forcing companies wanting to return to compensate Russian partners first. Disputes would now be settled on Russian terms, in Russian courts. Miss this shift, and you see Russia as a bystander, when in reality, Moscow just rewrote the rules. So what was in this decree that left Europe's leaders and CEOs reeling? Let's break it down. Europe's own tactics became its trap. Could anyone have seen this coming? When Putin's decree landed, the shockwaves were legal, not military. European companies, some of the world's biggest, suddenly faced a harsh choice: restore their Russian operations and pay taxes, or surrender their assets, sometimes built up over decades, to Russia. It was an ultimatum in legal language, but the message was clear. The balance of power had shifted. This wasn't just about Moscow protecting interests. It was surgical, strategic, and for Europe, it felt like payback for years of sanctions. Within a quarter, hundreds of industrial and energy assets, factories, pipelines, storage facilities, were transferred to Russian management. Companies that left, hoping to hurt Russia, now saw their assets fueling the Russian economy. It was a pivot point European media struggled to process. By evening, headlines shifted, from outrage to stunned respect. "We built the trap and fell into it," wrote one Italian commentator. "Putin played ahead. Now Europe has no moves left." While European governments scrambled, Moscow remained calm. No grand speeches or threats, just a clear statement. Disputes would be settled in Russian courts, and foreign companies had 6 months to decide their future in Russia. For European corporations, this was a regulatory nightmare. For politicians, a political headache. Overnight, they had to explain to voters and shareholders why billions in assets were at risk, why profits vanished, and why their own rules backfired. The real genius was in the details. The decree forced departing companies to compensate Russian partners if they wanted to keep any licenses or hope to return. Western legal analysts dubbed it Brussels' nightmare, because now, instead of international arbitration, every dispute played out under Russian law, on Russian timelines. Even the timing was calculated. The decree dropped on the day Europe reviews its economic year, a symbolic gesture. The message was clear. Russia wasn't reacting. It was setting the agenda. That evening, European newscasts showed a composed Putin outlining the new order. No bombast, just a line that sent ripples. "We are not closing the door. But now, Russia decides who and on what terms may enter." These words dominated news feeds, trending even in Germany. What surprised everyone was the reaction. Instead of anger, a grudging respect. "Here is a leader," some wrote. "At least someone is taking action." Even among experts, debate erupted. Was it time to admit the sanction regime had failed? One former EU diplomat said on French radio, "We underestimated the Kremlin's strategy. Putin isn't playing chess, he's writing new rules." Behind the scenes, European banks scrambled to clarify how to handle Russian assets, sending urgent questions to Moscow. In the European Parliament, the new reality set in. Europe no longer dictated terms to Russia. Russia dictated terms to Europe. As one newspaper put it, Putin turned sanctions into a mirror, and now we see ourselves. By next morning, Europe had woken up in a new world. Confident talk of new sanctions disappeared. Leaders struggled to understand their options. For companies, billions were at risk overnight. For governments, the risk was humiliation. For ordinary people, real economic instability, jobs, markets, investments, all suddenly in question. But the fallout was more than financial. Putin's move shattered Europe's sense of strategic confidence. And as we'll see, that loss would echo far beyond balance sheets. In one morning, Europe's leverage evaporated. What comes next? The day after Putin's decree, Europe woke up in a different world. Just yesterday, officials debated new sanctions. Now, they scrambled to respond, protect assets, and, most jarringly, operate on terms set by Russia. Cabinet meetings ran into the night. In Berlin, Paris, Rome, ministers pored over legal documents, trying to decipher Moscow's new rules. For once, the usual statements were replaced by stunned silence. Major banks, especially in France and Germany, immediately reached out to Russian regulators, asking, "What's the process for reclaiming assets? How should they apply?" Months ago, these institutions called for Russia's isolation. Now, they politely requested instructions from Moscow. Corporations faced a harsh deadline: 6 months to choose, return and comply, or lose everything. The pressure was intense for energy and manufacturing, where billions in assets were suddenly in limbo. Media narratives shifted overnight. Outrage gave way to grudging respect for Russia's cold, legal precision. One British headline: Putin seizes control of Europe's economy. Bloomberg analysts called it the most calculated economic strike against the West in decades. In Germany, economists admitted the landscape had changed. TV showed late-night meetings in Berlin, where officials debated how to secure raw materials if Moscow rewrote trade rules. One expert said, "This isn't just a response, it's a move, a possible checkmate." French politicians complained about principle violations, but industry leaders sought a way back into Russia. The French Energy Association said, "We respect the Russian decision and are ready to find mutually beneficial solutions." In Italy, headlines revealed major industrial groups negotiating directly with Moscow. A parliament member said, "It's time to stop pretending we can do without Russia." Even in the Baltics, where rhetoric is usually harshest, the tone shifted. A Latvian journalist admitted, "Putin played it so even our allies now have to talk to him. That's mastery you can't argue with." Brussels convened an emergency session, not for new sanctions, but to soften the blow. Divisions ran deep. Eastern Europe called for toughness. Western Europe pushed for dialogue. A German official summed it up. "If we keep pretending we control Russia, we risk losing control of Europe." What's at stake isn't just money or business. Europe faces the loss of economic control, strategic autonomy, and, the most painful, the credibility of its sanctions policy. Russia may face scrutiny, but it's clear who gained the upper hand. How did Russia pull off such a victory, and what can we learn? When the rules change overnight, who adapts and who loses? That's the real question for Europe. For Western companies, the game has flipped. Before, doing business in Russia was about profit. Now, it's about survival. Firms can't just leave. Under Putin's decree, if they want out, they must go through Russian courts, follow Russian law, and pay, not just in compensation, but in licensing fees. Any disputes? Settled on Moscow's turf. The frameworks that once protected Western interests in Russia have become traps, obligations they can't ignore without risking massive losses. What's striking isn't just the shift, but how methodical Russia was. While many in the West expected chaos, what happened was surgical. No shouting, just a document, executed by the book. As one Latvian journalist put it, "Putin played it so even our allies have to negotiate with him." Across Europe, the tone changed. Even in the Baltics, policymakers acknowledge the new reality. Russia holds the keys to Europe's economic engine. In Brussels, emergency meetings scrambled for unity, but consensus was impossible. As one German official said, "If we keep pretending we control Russia, we risk losing control of Europe." That line became a symbol of the new balance. Instead of the West dictating terms, Russia now sets the conditions. The impact rippled beyond boardrooms. On Russian markets, there was stability. The ruble climbed, investors relaxed. Even Western analysts admitted the move was smart, precise, effective. For businesses and governments, the lesson is clear. Ignore legal and economic shifts at your own peril. In a world where a single decree can redraw the map, failing to adapt risks, profits, and sovereignty. So, what's the final takeaway from this new chapter in Europe-Russia relations? Yesterday's world is gone. Who writes tomorrow's rules? For years, Europe believed stability was its domain. But this time, it wasn't tanks or threats that changed the game. It was a signature, a quiet decree, and a methodical rollout. Suddenly, European governments and corporations found themselves reacting, not leading. Italian, Spanish, even British commentators, usually quick to dismiss Moscow, couldn't ignore the shift. Putin played it with aristocratic finesse, one Spanish outlet said. A former European diplomat called it an uncontestable move. Even in London, think tanks admitted, Russia isn't playing by old rules, it's rewriting them. The most remarkable part? No chaos, no grandstanding. Moscow ministries calmly carried out orders. Regional leaders took charge. Everything unfolded legally, meticulously. Where the West expected outrage, they got a chess player calculating 3 steps ahead. As one German journalist put it, "We prepared for a storm, but got a chess match, and we lost the opening move." The result is more than a shift in power. It's a shift in perception. Europe, long used to looking east with skepticism, suddenly saw Moscow not as a disruptor, but as a peer. Calls for dialogue grew in Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, and Italy, as people tired of artificial confrontation. Why does this matter? Because overnight, the economic landscape and the rules of international power changed. If you care about your country's sovereignty, your company's future, or job stability, ignoring these shifts isn't just risky, it's a path to irrelevance. Knowing who moves the pieces is the first step to staying in the game. In this new era, the question isn't who holds the biggest stick, it's who writes the rules when the world turns upside down.